A Christmas Carol is a powerful story that has resonated with people for generations. That's why there are so many Christmas carols. Well, that and being in the public domain. As a result, different adaptations need to change things up sometimes. A setting update is a go-to move for many versions, and I believe the most notable example is 1988's Scrooged, directed by Richard Donner. This movie takes the classic tale and sets it at a broadcasting company in contemporary times. The Dickens London was a cold, harsh place for the lower class, and this movie has a fun time showing modern New York as being very similar. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Frank Cross, played by Bill Murray, is a ruthless TV executive. He's our Scrooge, and in a lot of ways, he's even worse than the original character. Scrooge is cruelly indifferent to the suffering of others. Frank seems to actually enjoy it. In general, Scrooged is very broad and over the top with its story, its characters, and the world they inhabit. For a good deal of the runtime, it's very mean and loud. Then, at the end, it becomes incredibly heartfelt and loud. Most of the criticism I've seen directed at the movie points to the last-minute tonal shift as a flaw, which I can understand. I love it myself, and although the shift is major, so is Frank's change of heart. I think it's the broad loudness that acts as the glue between the nasty and sentimental sides of the movie. It doesn't come together 100%, but it comes together enough. I've heard rumblings about how the original idea for the movie was to tell a much darker story, although I'm not sure how true that is. Composer Danny Elfman mentions this in the liner notes for one of his compilation albums, explaining that he was writing music with that interpretation in mind. We'll come back to Mr. Elfman's score later on. I do have a copy of one of the screenplay drafts, draft number 7, dated November 23, 1987, which was about 2 weeks before they started filming. There are some differences, as is often the case, but not enough to do a full script-to-screen video. I'll highlight a few as we come to them. Because the script was so close to when the shooting began, it doesn't give us any real insights about the supposed darker version. Scrooge is dark enough most of the time. There's plenty of slapstick and satire, but in between the comedy parts, we go to some pretty bleak places and get some legitimate scares. It might not fully be what Dickens intended, but it's a wonderfully wild ride. One of the reasons that Ebenezer Scrooge's story has endured so long is because he's a well-crafted character. We hate him just as much as everyone else when we're introduced to the old skinflint, but as we see the kind of sad life he's had up to this point, we soften a bit. Then, as he begins to soften himself and regret his actions, we soften even more. Frank Cross is a similar sort of character, although, as I've said, he's even crueler than Scrooge when the story starts. In the opening minutes, he fires one of his yes-men for daring to politely, timidly disagree with one of his decisions. He gleefully watches as the hapless man, Elliot Loudermilk, played by Bobcat Goldthwait, is thrown out. That same night, he receives a humanitarian award, and moments later, steals a taxi ride from an old lady. Between all this, he finds time to scream in his employees' faces. The spirits really have their work cut out for them. Still, as we see into Frank's past, we understand just what made him such an unlikable person. We find out that he's not just terrible, he's utterly broken. His father was incredibly harsh, and he was essentially raised by the TV. He can't think of any good memories when prompted. All he can recall are TV shows, and worst of all, he has to be reminded that these aren't actual childhood experiences.
I was a baseball player. One year I hit the home run that won the big game.
That was the kid on the courtship of Eddie's father.
Then, he's swept up into the crazy corporate world of TV production. An emotionally stunted person is thrust into an incredibly cutthroat business. You do the math. His one actual chance at love with a kind woman, Claire, fizzles out because he's too inept to make up with her after a disagreement. The funny thing is, he's kind of right during their argument. She wants to meet with friends like they've been planning, but he's presented with a once-in-a-lifetime meeting with a higher-up. This is the kind of meeting that could truly benefit his career, and we can see that it does in the future. The reason the breakup ends up being more Frank's fault is because he acts very rudely to her in the moment, and he never reaches back out to her afterward. This is the kind of thing they probably could have patched up much earlier if he had actually made an effort. As a result of how broken he is, it does take Frank a little longer to come around. He's still pretty sour during the Christmas present sequence, for instance. The movie actually throws an extra monkey wrench into his redemption arc. Instead of experiencing every ghost in a row, Frank actually goes through several days with the ghosts popping in at random moments. This makes him increasingly paranoid, since by the end, he realizes that anyone he meets can potentially be the next spirit. Meanwhile, his own job is on the line, and the ghosts are making him behave even more erratically than usual. The ghosts are fun, original takes on the Dickens characters. Like Frank Cross, they're a lot more malicious than the book versions. The Dickens spirits don't hold back with their blunt truths to Scrooge, but these ghosts physically torment Frank as well. He's knowingly hurt so many more people than Scrooge did that he's earned some extra pain. Sadly for him, it might be the only way to get the message across. The Jacob Marley stand-in is Frank's old mentor, Lou Hayward. No longer a ghost wrapped in chains, Hayward is a mouse-infested zombie dressed in a golf outfit since he had a heart attack during a game. His impressive makeup helped earn the movie an Academy Award nomination. Christmas Past is now a scuzzy New York cab driver. Christmas Present, wonderfully played by Carol Kane, steals the show as an extra sadistic take on Glinda the Good Witch. The highlight for me is the hulking Christmas Future. He's arguably the closest one to the book, with his body being hidden under a hooded cloak, but he has a few alterations. His face is a TV screen showing a series of alternating images, including a brief shot of Frank's face crossed with a skull. And he's got a few guests hiding in there.
Did our people do that? We're gonna get phone calls.
Outside of the spirits, we have Alfred Woodard as Grace, the Bob Cratchit stand-in. Like Cratchit, she's very put upon by her uncaring boss and has to support her struggling family on a low pay. Unlike Cratchit, she's actually able to stand up to Frank just a tiny bit. She knows she has to watch herself, but she seems to be able to get away with a fraction more than most of Frank's underlings. The Tiny Tim equivalent is Grace's son, Calvin. Instead of Tim's physical disability, Calvin has an emotional one. He saw his father get killed and hasn't spoken since. None of the expensive doctors have been able to help him, and if no one can get through to the poor child, his future looks bad. In addition to being a modern dark comedy version of A Christmas Carol, Scrooge is a great satire of the TV industry. Just as Ebenezer had to harden his heart when he entered the world of business, Frank had to claw his way up the corporate ladder. Nothing's a given in that dog-eat-dog world, as evidenced by the character Bryce Cummings. Bryce is a consultant hired to help Frank's newest project, a live TV production of A Christmas Carol, and he's clearly gunning for Frank's position. For most of the movie, he's very charming, but it's not hard to imagine that he's just as bad as Frank under that smile. It's the corporate world, a lot of people are phonies. I do wish that we'd gotten to see a little more of Bryce's bad side though, since it would make his eventual punishment seem a bit more deserved. As it is, Frank has basically staked his job on this project. Everyone needs to watch this Christmas Carol or he's out. He wants to make this the biggest, flashiest, gaudiest version of the story the world's ever seen. Mary Lou Retton is a somersaulting Tiny Tim. The solid gold dancers are featured in provocative outfits. Buddy Hackett stars as a hilariously miscast Scrooge. The screenplay actually had Marlon Brando as the Scrooge actor, but I imagine he might have been too expensive. He had previously worked with Donner on Superman as Jor-El, though, so perhaps it was a scheduling conflict. I think Brando fits the idea of Frank's extravagant Christmas Carol better, but Hackett is still a funny choice. The screenplay also wanted Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill as Jacob Marley. Oddly, their production is never called A Christmas Carol at any point in the movie. It's only referred to as Scrooge. The copy of the screenplay I have is also called Scrooge, as opposed to the past tense Scrooged. I'm at a loss as to why they don't call the Dickens story by its proper title at any point. It's been in the public domain for the longest time. Despite putting on this Scrooge spectacular, Frank never seems to realize the parallels to what he's experiencing. If he does, he doesn't actually say so. I actually appreciate that this movie doesn't get too meta on us, since the plot is already meta enough. Besides, given how oblivious Frank is, I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't even know the full Christmas Carol story. That would play into the satire perfectly. There are plenty of examples of executives not actually caring about or understanding what they're working on. There are so many things to love in this movie. The jokes all land, it's incredibly quotable, it's not afraid to get truly scary, and it's also not afraid to get truly heartfelt. This is one of those movies where the emotion runs high and never lets up. Whether it's being silly, sentimental, or terrifying, it hits you full force. I think the Christmas Future sequence especially knocks it out of the park with some wonderfully twisted set design. Everything up to that point has been more or less reflective of our reality. Yes, we have the ghosts magically tormenting Frank, but even then, the world around them felt like ours. In this section, the rest of the world gets just as contorted to really sell the idea of a very bad future. The asylum where Calvin ends up appears to be filmed at a Dutch angle, but then Frank starts sliding and we realize that the hallway is actually slanted. Claire, meanwhile, has become a harpy caked in creepy pale makeup. She's dining with her new, equally terrible friends in a restaurant apparently located in some ethereal limbo. The final part of the climax is no slouch either. Instead of just seeing his grave, Frank finds himself trapped in his own coffin as it gets cremated. The screenplay handles this scene a little differently. Frank exits the elevator into a graveyard. The elevator itself is inside a mausoleum. When he sees his grave, he runs back into the elevator. The doors close, and he finds himself in his coffin, now buried alive. That's scary enough, but I love the extra horror push in the final film. We don't see how Frank winds up in the coffin. He's pulling on it, and then suddenly he's inside. It's pure nightmare logic. I should also mention a deleted scene in the script that I loved. I have no idea if this was filmed or not, but it also involves Christmas Future. Before Frank encounters the real ghosts, there's a great bit where he runs into an actor from the TV production and reacts in absolute terror. In the script, the scene would have gone on a little longer. After Frank leaves, the actor sits down alone in a dressing room. He removes the skull mask to reveal an actual skull underneath. He's been the real deal the whole time. If they did film this, I hope we can see the footage someday. This was not a Tim Burton movie. In fact, it lost the Oscar award to Beetlejuice. But these moments, coupled with the Danny Elfman score, definitely give it a classic Burton vibe. Speaking of Elfman, he wrote a very fun, very in-character score. If you're a fan of film music or just Danny Elfman, you'll know that his early scores had a certain sound that came to define his career, even though he's written plenty of different sounding pieces over the years. This is the quintessential 80s Elfman sound. A few years later, he appeared to quote a bit of his main Scrooged theme during Jack's flight in The Nightmare Before Christmas. Richard Donner had initially considered John Williams to score the film after working with him on Superman. If you're curious as to how Scrooge would have sounded with a Williams soundtrack, I recommend listening to The Witches of Eastwick from the previous year. I would imagine that Williams could have conjured up something similar to this devilish composition. To add to the Elfman connection, portions of the Nightmare Before Christmas workprint have Eastwick playing as a temp track. Donner would work with Elfman again on the Tales from the Crypt TV series. There are lots of great moments in Scrooge that I could draw attention to, but we'd be here all day. There's the Dormouse, the waiter hallucination, the action Santa Claus movie with Lee Majors. In the script, the role was written for Chuck Norris, which probably would have been even funnier today. I think my absolute favorite thing in the movie is at the very end. To appreciate it, we need to go to the midway point. Between his visits from Christmas past and present, Frank goes to see Claire at a homeless shelter. He blows off one of the homeless people, Herman, on the way out. Later, Christmas Present abandons Frank somewhere under the streets of New York, where he encounters Herman again, the poor man now having frozen to death. It's a scary, sad, sobering moment for both Frank and the audience, and it seems to be in lieu of Ignorance and Want from the original book. Later, just about everyone shows up for the movie's big finale. I love it when this happens. I love these curtain call endings. As they all sing together, Frank looks up to see that the ghosts are looking down on him as well. Even the more unfortunate ones, like Lou and the tortured spirits inside Future, get a chance to join in the party, which is already pretty sweet. But what I find the most touching is that Herman's there as well, now a happy angel with his own set of wings. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of thing that not every movie would think of doing. Moments like this show that the people working on it actually cared about the characters. And because they cared, it's easier for us to care as well. It's really interesting to see how this movie has aged. I'm not saying it aged poorly. I mean, it's funny how it was meant to be a modernization, but now it seems like a period piece itself. This is a movie firmly in the 80s, with Mary Lou Retton and references to Chernobyl and West Berlin. No matter what the time period, the point of A Christmas Carol remains relevant. As the years go by, I find myself getting more cynical. I often worry that we're losing sight of the universal truths of that story: family, friends, charity, kindness, and spirituality. But knowing that A Christmas Carol continues to be told, and seeing that even a movie as hilariously crass as Scrooge can still embrace those truths, well, that gives me a little more hope for all of us.